introduce new writing, new writers, and new ideas. So for tonight, we have Jolene, and I was puzzled whether I might go over to Cookie to introduce her and start the session. Thank you.
Hello everyone, good evening. It is a great pleasure and honor to be here today with Jolene. So Jolene is a colleague, and we work together at Aware, and it's really exciting to get to do this with her because I think it was first of all really exciting to get to read the book because I think it's a whole different experience to read the writing of someone whom you know, and as you're reading it, it's quite an exciting experience. So Jolene is the Communications and Programs Senior Manager at Aware, and this is her first book. So it is quite exciting. I'm a bit nervous. Okay, so how many of you read the book? Okay, great. Awesome. Wasn't it a splendid book? So when I read the book, the feeling that I was left with at the end of it, that still remains, is this sense of that stories that very often don't got told. You know, and that voices that we don't hear often in Singapore were heard. You know, like the voices of people who get bullied in school, or just in general voices of students, or the voices of gay people. You know, and that was really, I think, important for me as something I took away from the book. So I want to start by asking Jolene, did you decide to write a certain exposure because there was something that you wanted to say, like a story you wanted to tell, and then that turned into wanting to write it? Or did it start with wanting to write and then thinking of the story to tell because you wanted to write?
I think this is probably the wrong answer, but it was very much a case that I had always wanted to write a book. Ever since I was about 6, I wanted to write fiction. But I guess as I got older, especially as I entered like working world and adult life, I kind of started to think that I can write decent sentences, but I don't really have a story to tell. And I think what suddenly made writing a novel seem possible to me was I read a book called Still Life by an author called A.S. Wyatt. And it didn't have a story in the sense that I then understood stories. It was more exploration of relationships and dynamics between people and ideas. I mean, it very much had a story and a plot, but it wasn't the kind of straightforward story that I envisaged before then. And I finished that and I felt that was absolutely splendid. That was one of the most pleasurable experiences of my life, reading that book, and writing something in that vein would definitely be very worthwhile. So then I thought, okay, I can do this. I will think about writing a book. And I guess sort of fragments of ideas and dynamics and relationships that I had been thinking about for a long time, and maybe perhaps putting to paper in a very tentative form, or putting to screen in a very tentative form in scraps for like years, but only ever for a few days at a time. I kind of unearthed them, I guess, and then told myself that if I was going to do this, I could do it properly. So I sat down and I made sure that given that I knew that for me, sticking to the story was a hard thing, made sure that I plotted out a timeline and had all the major events down before I continued to like kind of write, and then it happened. So I guess it was, to answer the question, like, I wanted to write a book, and the story kind of came around later.
Right. As you were saying that, it just kind of made me think, often like in a creative process, what we imagine at the beginning and then what happens aren't necessarily the same thing. So for you, to what extent was what you wanted to do with the book? What happened with the book?
I would say that to a very large extent, the book is as I intended in terms of a lot of the key events and a lot of the key dynamics. But of course what I found, and I guess what many people find when they actually decide to work on something rather than daydream about it, is that there was a lot more complexity in the execution than I had expected beforehand. And I had kind of loose ideas about the characters and their relationships and the actions that they would take, but actually making that into a readable, plausible work of fiction required a lot of what I experienced as psychological problem solving. I felt like so much of the book was just problem solving. It was, here I have these set of things that I know are going to happen. How can I reconcile them to make sense? And this required me to kind of go back and forth over the elements that I kind of had and I guess psychological story that I had for these people, and the two had to kind of influence one another and shape one another until I guess things kind of came to focus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's always particularly for me exciting and pleasurable to read local literature, just because there's so much familiarity. There are people whose stories that just come alive so much more to me because it's from a world that at least to some degree is my world. And of course a big part of this is English, right, for me. So I was just like curious as I was reading it because the book was also released in London, and as you were writing it, did you think about whether the use of Singlish or local references and how that would be received by readers outside of Singapore?
Yeah, I wrote most of this book when I wasn't living here. I started it when I was living in London, and I finished it when I was living in Heidelberg in Germany. So I guess given that in general my mind was not occupied here, I obviously was very conscious of how it might be looked at outside. I would say that it was a bit of a balancing act because I aimed to write for, I guess, some completely artificial notion of a general Anglophone reader, which was such a problematic kind of thing to construct. But I guess, on the one hand, I wanted it to be comprehensible to someone who hasn't lived here. On the other hand, I didn't want to write for a foreign eye. And I definitely didn't want to have this kind of Victorian ethnograph approach to look at the quaint words and customs of these people, sort of told to it.
The exoticizing.
Yeah, exactly. So I like to think that the more local references and elements that I've included, including the Singlish terms, can be understood through context. And my non-Singaporean test editors seem to feel that it was not a problem for them. But I mean, it doesn't make any sense to write a novel set in Singapore that doesn't use English. I mean, it's completely incoherent, right? So I hope that I struck some kind of balance there.
A lot of what struck me also as I was reading the book is that every character has a struggle, right? And this was, I think, came across really powerfully for me as well. So was this something that you consciously put in every character? Somehow it seems to be struggling between individual aspirations and fears and the force of society and norms and expectations upon them, as opposed to what they really want. And was that something that was a very conscious part of characterizing each of them?
I guess yes and no. I aim to write what I think are believable people who are psychologically plausible. And I guess perhaps it's part of my view of people in general that I think that's true of everyone. I think that every single one of us is a mass of competing and oftentimes contradictory impulses, and that the balance of these contradictions and impulses is going to change from second to second, day to day, year to year, and also that none of us is exactly as the social forces and pressures would have us be. As much as one of the main characters, Andrew, in this book tries very hard to be what he is told is approved and required, I don't think any of us is. So I guess it's very much about both of just the way that I see people in general, that the characters appear in that way. Yeah.
Does any of it have to do with, do you feel that in Singapore in particular, that these forces are something that are particularly strong, that people need to contend with every day? Was that something that influenced, what a major part of the writing that was?
I guess it's a bit difficult to make the comparative statement because, like, I don't know, I mean, there are so many places in the world that I have more experience, and certainly I've only grown up here. I definitely think that the book focuses largely on the teenage years, or the childhood and teenage years of a range of characters, and I definitely think that the experience of being a young person here is one that's very much characterized by all sorts of mechanisms of control and requirements from competing directions. How do you become the approved persona for your parents, for schools, for your peers? All these criteria are manifold, often conflicting, and almost completely unattainable. And I guess that's why the characters experience what they do.
So that struck a personal chord with me as well, because I think growing up in Singapore as a young person, I had like a lot of angst, and very much like whether it was needing to get approval from home or school or teachers or peers, and all of those ways, not fitting in and feeling suppressed in many ways. But and also, and that's why it feels cathartic as well to read something that doesn't tell necessarily your story, but a story that can mirror some of those experiences. And though from some of the people that I've spoken to, also read the book, one of the feelings that one does feel throughout the book is this sense of helplessness as well, right? Against like all these forces that seem so daunting, like teachers in school being horrible, or parents who just don't accept you, or peers who are so judgmental, and it seems that, but there's still a feeling of constant struggle and trying to fight that and overcome it. Right? So, what do you think in the book? Which characters maybe, or what spaces do you think show this possibility? Even though, like, overarchingly, there seems to be this tone of helplessness and, oh my god, no matter how much you try, like, someone's going to bring you down, someone's going to stamp all over what you're trying to do. But where do you think there is space for possibilities for better things?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I guess as I wrote it, I didn't think, God, this book is a dumb and I think that's a failing, and one that I had to very much consciously work to address. And I guess one of the reasons why I'm a feminist activist is that I believe that many of these issues of individual struggle cannot necessarily be resolved, or actually just cannot be resolved at an individual level. But of course it would have been absurd and a dreadful novel if the solution was that everybody in it became activists. But there are definitely choices that I made in writing the book that were intended to illustrate maybe not clear paths forward, but a suggestion of some paths forward. So, for example, I know, it is a book about a young gay man who kills himself. So that definitely raises the kind of spectre of the cliche or the tragic. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want that to be the sort of dominant representation of like gay people in the book. So I've also tried hard to make sure that there was also a strong counterpoint in terms of another lesbian couple and the way that they, against all sorts of odds, struggle to make a home together and succeed, not entirely without sort of costs as they find, but nevertheless create this despite the pressures that they face, and also that they themselves look at, or certainly like they look at what happens to Andrew, and they themselves answer this question, like how do we show the young people who are out there that actually this sort of success, however partial, however painful, is possible. So that was one of the major sort of arcs in
to me, like one of the other characters who represents that is feeling, right? Like because she's brought down so much by everybody around her and her peers constantly, and doesn't seem to gain much acceptance, and is always like the weirdo and all that. But she sticks with it until the end. She's fighting, and that in itself seems to represent some kind of possibility and hope, like that you can keep doing that as well. What was also really interesting to me about the book is the parallel unfolding of like real political events at the time in Singapore, right? In specific Operation Spectrum. So, what motivated you to put that into the book? Because it's interesting that in a piece that is fiction, parallelly there is something that is fact and very real of that period. So, what was that about?
Maybe a bit of background for people who haven't read the book. The book is primarily a family drama centered on a pair of twin brothers and their childhood and adolescence. But there are some scenes early on when one of the brothers and some of the other characters see on television an interview with Vincent Cheng, who is a real person. I hope he forgives me for my representation of him in this book. But this was a real incident in which, as I'm sure many of you know, over 20 activists were detained without trial because of their involvement in an alleged Marxist conspiracy, a charge that is widely regarded as quite laughable. In any case, he is interviewed on television, and Andrew watches this. And even though he's not a particularly political 12-year-old boy as it is, it has a lasting impact on him. And I guess this is one of those sort of fragments that I had been thinking about including in fiction for many years, long before I decided to write this book. Because it seemed to me like, I guess, a nice tableau showing how the political and personal can come together. And even though Andrew doesn't quite understand everything that's going on, he sees that this is what power can do, and that these are the potential consequences for holding to something that power wishes to suppress. And he learns that lesson now. And I guess it's also kind of relevant to me because I think that for many years I was a very depoliticized and naive person, and possibly still quite naive. But in any case, I think one of the turning points in my understanding of politics in this society was when I finally really read about the Marxist conspiracy and the realization that all this had happened and that we were taught nothing about it in school. And that, this had just been allowed to kind of slip away. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because that was kind of my coming into whether it was activism or just, like thinking about my life life here politically was discovering that, oh my god, this big thing had happened, right? The whole apparent Marxist controversy that then my generation didn't grow up knowing that happened at all, and that we had like some of the longest political prisoners in the world in Singapore, but that this was something that was not at all part of the narrative that I knew of my country.
I remember having this kind of, I guess what I would term a pre-wing moment after one of the characters in the book, when I had just read about the Marxist conspiracy, and then I went out to pizza with like some of my friends, and I banged the table and I said to them, do you know about this? Do you know about this? They were put in jail. They were put in jail. And they were just like, what's wrong? Why is she talking about this?
Yeah. So again, like that was another thing about the book that I felt like key, because it's one thing for it to be talked about in books about that, right? And another thing that presents that as a historical and real background to a fictional story, because somehow that seems to give it even more legitimacy. That we don't have to tell the story because it's not told. We're telling it because it's true and it's real and as natural as anything else you might refer to about Singapore in that period.
I mean, in kind of funny way, I guess fiction kind of makes things more real. Yeah, right?
Because it's referred to just as a matter of fact, rather than something that we need to justify and tell as well, right? One of the other things that struck me as I was reading the book is that most of the main characters are Chinese, right? And while there are non-Chinese characters in the book, they don't get as much page time or as much of the story told from their perspective. They're talked about and talked in relation to, but not so much talked from their point of view. And is this because you're less comfortable talking about things from the perspectives of, say, Malay or Indian people in Singapore?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, because I think this is a question that I keep expecting people to ask, and no one actually has, so thank you. It is, I would say, and I think this is one of the severe limitations of the book, but it is primarily a book about Chinese people. I think that the cases where we see more what's going on in the heads or more actions and speeches of the non-Chinese characters tends to reflect the extent of my, I guess, my own contact with non-Chinese people as someone who grew up in a very Chinese-dominated, I guess, social circle and family circle, which is, for instance, in the kind of social exchanges about maybe their interests, or we see quite a lot of passage about teacher, and so that's like their participation in like public space. What I didn't feel comfortable writing, and which I'm not sure that I do yet as well, is an informed understanding of non-Chinese character that takes into account things like their personal family experiences, because I guess that's where my own kind of cultural ignorance comes in. And I mean, I think this is very unsatisfactory. I think the only satisfactory and responsible answer for like a Chinese person in a Chinese-dominated society where the Chinese narratives are the ones that prevail is to actually get to know the lives of non-Chinese people better and include them in representation. So I actually think this is one of the major limitations of the book as far as I'm concerned. And I guess maybe this would be a good time to read one of the passages, because it's interesting to have this discussion as well, because part of this book is also about racism. But I think it is a limitation that the portrayal of racism in this book is a discussion of the ways in which Chinese people can behave in a very racist way, and not so much the story of the people who are actually impacted by racism. But for what it's worth, there is a representation of it here which I will now read. So this is in relation to one of the major characters. The story's two main characters are twin brothers, and one of the characters, Brian, when he is 12, has a childhood romance with an Indian girl called Priya, whom he meets in his neighborhood. And this is the story of how this relationship is sabotaged by his cousin who is angry at him and sets his parents on him, basically. That was the last of Mabel's visits. Over dinner, she cheerfully informed everyone that, in her opinion, Andrew was so much better now and no longer needed her help. So if Auntie and Uncle didn't mind, she wouldn't come round anymore. Brian later assumed that Mabel had drawn his parents aside unnoticed. In fact, she said nothing to them. A dry mention to her mother was enough to do the trick. Auntie Pauline, all aflutter, called her sister the next day, prompted only, of course, by her deep concern for the family's well-being. She didn't enjoy talking of such shameful things, but she knew Pauline would realize how serious it was and how bad it must look. If it were her own daughter who had behaved in this way, she would feel so ashamed. And the worst thing was, if Mabel had seen Brian doing hanky-panky with this fat Indian in public, who knew how many neighbors must have seen it too? Everyone knew boy-girl relationships were a danger in secondary school, but you didn't expect it to start so early. And in Brian's PSLE year some more, Pauline must be especially worried. She wasn't thinking it meant they were bad parents who didn't know how to control their children properly. Oh no, it was probably the fashion to give your children a lot of freedom these days. Although Pauline herself had always thought it was important not to just blindly follow fashion. When it came to her own girls, even though she taught them good Christian principles, she thought it was better to restrict them a little bit. Better not to take chances, because once children began to rebel, it was very hard to get them to come back to you. Pauline said very little. She was disoriented by the idea of her son doing hanky-panky with anyone. An essentially inconceivable idea, given unwelcome solidity by the fatness and Indianness of this mystery girl. These were distracting, almost mesmerizing facts. She wondered how best to communicate them to her husband. She considered herself a practical parent, and a flexible one too. This business with Brian must stop, of course, but preferably without drama, something she worried Kim Seng had an occasional tendency to indulge. She was roused by a high edge in Pauline's voice. You know, some of these Malay and Indian girls are very advanced one. 13, 14, already having babies. And you better be careful when he's older. Make sure he meets some good Chinese girls. Otherwise, next time you get an Indian daughter-in-law, then you know. I asked Mabel if this one was one of the fair-skinned type. You know, some of them are not so dark. But Mabel said no, she was one of the very black ones. She bubbled over into nervous laughter. Pauline felt a surge of irritation. Okay, she said. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks for telling me about this. We must talk to Brian. Everything okay with you? Oh, yes, it's all fine. Good to have Mabel back home also. Always get worried when she goes out so much. You just never know what kind of influence there'll be on them all. But good that she told me this lah. Sure, she has good values. I just wanted to make sure you knew what your son has been up to. Yes, thanks, Pauline repeated. Okay, don't forget we have booked 2 tables at Jin Long for Ma's birthday. Yes, of course. Don't worry, Amin. I'm sure it will be okay with Brian. He's still young. Just talk to him firmly. We will. Okay, bye.
So that was actually one of my favorite passages in the book, and because it made it so stark, also in contrast to actually, like when you read the book, Brian's and Priya's interaction, right? And there's all this horrible adult talk. Doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's like, again, it's this very beautiful and unassuming and innocent interaction between 2 people, and it's very starkly, I think, shows up how children don't necessarily think of each other in terms of gender or race or anything, but just as like people they're interacting with. And the part where his parents speak to Brian, you see that it's like it dawns on him, right? That all this adult world is something that actually impacts his reality, and it's not so separate anymore. Is there anything else you want to read in relation?
Yeah, we could read. Yeah, okay. So I guess by contrast, there's a passage which is about Priya's own reflections on what happens with her and Brian many years later. And I mean, I think following on from what you said earlier about the dominance of Chinese Priya is an underutilized character. But I guess this is one of those rare passages where she gets a bit more of a airtime. Much later on, Priya remembered and forgot Brian in quite a different way from how he remembered and forgot her. Events as such escaped him, but the hours together became suffused for him with tints of romance, wistfulness, tragedy, that became the full substance of his association with Priya Menon. She was what he had lost. She, on the other hand, understood the entire business as a textureless sequence of things that had happened, concluding in a lesson to be learned. Any memory of how she had felt that June only increased her contempt for her own childish self. Brian himself sank beneath consideration. He was a delusion, fractured by fate, which would be worse and useless to repeat. So she was thrown when, in March of 1998, the news reports were published, and his face was everywhere, almost familiar, but impossible to identify. It was, in fact, the second time pictures of him had made the rounds. He had also been in all the papers 4 years earlier. But Priya had no interest in the government's annual awards to its scholars, those overachieving school kids chosen for cultivation as young mandarins, who received full funding for their Ivy League and Oxbridge undergraduate courses, and became contractually bound to, were greasily accelerated up the civil service ladder. Every year, among the few hundred selected for this privilege, a tinier handful still were anointed elite among the elite. These were photographed in suits and smiles, a trio or quartet of smart, toothy marionettes, and splashed across the street lines. Nothing had registered with Priya then. She had simply turned the page. Now, though, the story was irresistible. Suicide scholar hid unstable tendencies. And why, she asked herself, was a curious bubble of recognition welling in her as she looked at this thin, bright young man. His name meant nothing. She had never seen him. But at the same time, she felt bodily certain that she had. There were no clues in the text. The stratospheric schools he'd attended, the awards he'd won, his unfinished master's degree in mathematics. Assurances from the Civil Service Board that scholarship holders were not only the very best academic talents, but also underwent stringent psychological assessment. Every care was taken with taxpayer money, but mistakes did happen. The system took into account the possibility of a small percentage of error. Some people were tragically unable to cope with stress in their personal lives. The bereaved family had no comment. She stared again at his face and forgot about it for most of the rest of the day. That evening, walking home from the bus stop, she thought how much more pleasant it was now when the hot grey fuzz of the year before had lifted through the air, even if the Sumatran forest was still, by all accounts, burning. And the connection appeared in her mind all at once. The suicide guy, it was that random and embarrassing boy. Brian had been his name. She surprised herself by retrieving the useless fact from some unlit mental recess. He had a brother who looked just like him. It was the brother whom she had indeed never met. This feeling of recognition was the only evidence that she had ever met Brian himself. Nothing else in her life corroborated it. No one knew about him. He had been a story beneath telling. It was odd to think of his reality somewhere out there, maybe living nearby still, even odder, and on the reality of his grief. Surely he was grieving. His parents, silent players in the childhood drama, known only as objects of resentment, now given this extra dimension, they must be grieving too. She thought of the unknown brother, a stranger figure, whose sensitivities were being publicly canvassed, and she wondered how he had been, that brother, in that family. She felt pity, and then a flush of muted anger, ebbing even as it surged. An anger at her pity, an anger which intensified her pity. She did not want to feel sorry for them. She had no right to it, they had no right to it. And yet, she did feel sorry for them. She did.
I think that so the passage that you just read also makes a lot of references to the education system in Singapore, right? And this was a thread that was consistent throughout a lot of the book. control, like a lot of like imagery as well that kind of brings to mind this whole like factory-like, system. You use like powerful words like a taxonomy, people, and things like that, which kind of really worked to bring out the very hierarchical rat race that this is, that's steeped in like privilege and exclusion. Also, like on a more very relatable level, it also, the book explores what it means for like a kid from a HDB flat to make it to like an elite school in Singapore. And so, like, what were the things about the education system that you were trying to show up in the book? And how do you think the different characters bring that out
Yeah, I think that may be over again the playing slightly. I don't think that the book really does show so much like what it means, or what the experience or struggles of someone from I guess a lower income background working their way up would be like. I mean, I think that the family who this center is like, quite comfortable. Like they're not very well off, but they're certainly comfortable. But what I do think is there is the way in which people in the elite school system, which, I mean, full disclaimer, I also went through, the way that that is discussed, and the way that there's a lot of pouncing on various kind of class hierarchies, and one of the central characters in this book is a boy who, went to all sorts of elite schools and is very comfortably off. Parents live in a condominium, and yet he feels this kind of sharp sting of envy because, however comfortably off he actually is, surrounded by all these people who are taking holidays to Europe every year and have chauffeurs. He feels himself to be subjectively not well off. And the kind of story that he then tells himself about his classmate who lives in the HDB flat is like part of this kind of, I guess, a kind of, I don't know, a sort of romance that he tells himself about that as well. So I think the story is less about the actual struggles of people who are disadvantaged by class, and more about some of the class prejudices that people with the elite have.
Okay. Any questions from the audience in relation to the book for Jolene?